Thank you all for coming. My name is Gary Schindel. I'm the Administrative Vice President for the NSS, and this is the first of 3 Luminary series that we have. We're offering at the convention this week. I want to thank you all for coming. I also want to thank our speakers today. They put a great deal of work and time, not just in preparing this, but in their entire caving careers. So we're gonna see a great talk among many of our speakers today. I do ask a couple housekeeping things. One is if you have a cell phone, if you would be so kind as to turn it off. We are recording these, and they will go on to the NSS webpage, and you can download them later and use them for Grotto programs and all kinds of other presentations that you'd like to make. Having said that, I'd like to introduce Dave Hughes, who is going to introduce our speaker today. So thank you.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Today's speaker is Dr. Art Palmer. Art joined the NSS way back on October 9th of 1957. Earned a Ph.D. from Indiana University in 1969 and went on to a long and distinguished career at the State University of New York and has had an adjunct professorship at Mississippi State University and Western Kentucky University. Art has served on the staff of many prestigious scientific journals, including those published in Britain, China, France, Hungary, Slovenia, and of course, the United States. But not only a reviewer and an editor, but Art is a brilliant writer himself. He has written many scientific papers, many articles for popular readers, a number of booklets, pamphlets, guidebooks, and my personal favorite is a wonderful 2007 book called Cave Geology. Of all the books in my personal caving collection, that's one of my very favorites, brilliantly written, beautifully illustrated, and magnificently produced. If you are interested in geology or hydrology and have a pulse rate above the freezing point of helium, I suspect that you will enjoy Art's book, Cave Geology. Amongst a lifetime of brilliant decisions, Art's most brilliant certainly was to marry his dear wife, Peggy. Peg and Art are truly an all-American couple, a wonderful team, and a great illustration of the algebraic anomaly that the sum can really be truly greater than the individual parts. So thank you, Peg, for coming today, and thank you for being such a wonderful part of Art's professional success and the joy in his lifetime. It's truly an honor today to introduce a great caver, a brilliant scientist, a truly wonderful guy, and a great friend. Please enjoy your afternoon with 2013 NSS Luminary, Dr. Art Palmer.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Gary. And thank you, Peggy. Can you all hear me properly? I know you can all hear me, but is the sound okay? Great. Up a little? I'll just raise my voice a little. How's that? Okay, well, I think with no further ado, I'll just start off. Lights, please. I feel a little bit awkward being a luminary speaker because I tend to spread darkness wherever I go. And so let's see, how does this thing work? Right is, oh, yeah. I've always been interested in caving, and I came from a sort of odd background, close but rather financially strapped family in western Massachusetts, Pittsfield, Mass., which turns out to have been at that time a hotbed of caving. So what I'd like to do is to move on and suggest a few things that you might want to consider when seeing me on the street. I've always been interested in caves, even before I've been to one. It's kind of odd how you're a child and you sort of are enamored of certain things and you've never really had any personal experience with them. Things I dreamed of when young, and bear with me because this was when I was like 10 years old or something, to explore hidden and mysterious places. I think I've done plenty of that. This aspect here, I don't know if that really applies. And this is on record. And that was actually in my high school yearbook. But I spent little time thinking ahead, groping in the dark, so to speak. So the Luminary series just seems out of place for me. I did spend a lot of time in the dark. Here is one of the first pictures of me in the caving garb. Notice the helmet and the lamp and so forth. That's my little brother Dave, 7 years younger, cast from the same mold. He was a brilliant caver too, although he decided to become something else instead. Our family was very supportive. Most people would be appalled at the things we did, but they cheered them, and they had trust in us. I think that helped a lot. I said that Pittsfield, Mass. Was a hotbed of caving, and there's one reason for that. The noted author Clay Perry, author of many cave books, was brought up in Pittsfield, Mass., and he was retired at the time I started caving in the early, my mid-teens, I would say. And so I went up and I saw him in his honorary office at the local paper, and he told me where to go, and we did, and ended up in some pretty exciting places. Another stimulating aspect of my birth as a caver was to read The Caves Beyond by Roger Brucker, who's lurking in the shadows there. I can still look at this book and my pulse rate goes up about 20 beats per minute because it was so well written. It's actually by Joe Lawrence Jr. and but the whole book was really written by Roger, and I thank Roger very much for having written this book because it was important in getting me started. Let me see, this is Roger here. And Rain Curl also had, unknown to him, had a very strong influence on me. Our very first real cave was Eldon's Cave in Massachusetts, just south of our hometown. And Rain had asked some of his caving buddies to collect plaster cast of the cave walls. These are well scalloped walls. So they plastered on some plaster, let it set, and then they couldn't get it off the wall. And I don't know if it's still there, but it's probably been scrubbed off since. But that was a very enlightening beginning to our caving because it was surrounded by real cavers and doing real science and so forth. The Gurneys have had a big influence, at least in the early stages of my career, because they were the guiding lights of northeastern caver. Russ Gurney and his wife Jean, who was one of the luminary speakers last year. And I believe that's their daughter Susan rather than Wendy. I needed to go to college, and so I decided on a fairly close by college where I didn't have to travel very far, Williams College, Northwestern Mass. And I was a full-fledged caver by that time, and I had my rope that I'd bought at the hardware store. It was 5/8 or 3/4. No, I think it was 3/4 inch manila. No problem with stretch there, but you could really get a grip on it, and it served well its purpose well. My first intelligent act at Williams was to put up a little sign saying anyone interested in going caving, and I came back the next day and the whole sheet was filled up with names. The very first name on the list was Chuck Porter, whom many of you know. He's still NSS 5330. Let's see, here's Chuck himself right there. A couple of other people, myself and Lou Harvey. I'm introducing a topic here that is very important to me because my first real experience doing science was to write an honors thesis as a senior. And what better thesis than to pick a thesis topic on caves. So this really got me started on the topic. Here's where Chuck and Lou and about 7 other cavers hung out at Williams College. This is kind of a long story here. Obviously, this is not contemporary. That's last year. But this is one of the places that people hung out when there wasn't room in the dorms. Nobody wanted cavers in their dorms. And Hugh Blanchard from Boston Grotto was a very close friend back around 1957 to 61 or so before he left the area. He got us permission to visit a place called Skull Cave in New York. Skull Cave had been closed and is today, but we got a window of opportunity to go to this cave, marvelous cave. Here it is. It's actually a horrible hole, and this became the subject of my thesis. Lots of people helped. I couldn't have done it without these people. And there's one encounter that I remember vividly. Rich Garland in the crawlway of Skull Cave, about 800 feet of crawling, he says, do you think you could explain this cave with chemical and hydrologic equations? And I answered, no. And I was pretty convinced at that time, but maybe I was wrong. The cave has got some nice places in it. Constantly crawling, climbing, squeezing, lots of mud, lots of water. And there are some big places, but they just make the little places seem all the worse. So it's a much worse cave than can be conveyed here. In fact, there are quotes that we can give you, such as, "Leave me here, I'm going to die," said one of our helpers. And another person kissed the ground when he got to the entrance, and so forth. Here's Lou after a typical trip. This wasn't even a long one, but his knees are all shot, you can see. And he was the only one to wear knee pads, so we scoffed at him for that. And of course, there were no wetsuits in those days. This is about 1959, I guess. Here's the final map of the cave, including some things that happened after I finished my thesis. This section right here was discovered by Will Crowther in the mid-60s, and then there's another section discovered by Mike Queen around 1970, which we eventually added to the map. But the section that I worked on was basically the rest of the cave. So my job was to kind of figure out how the cave formed. What its geology was, that was easy, but how it formed was not. Because at that time, speleogenesis was really kind of a black art. It was very difficult to get a handle on exactly how things worked. A lot of relation to the water table and things like that. But there was light at the end of the tunnel, or maybe at the beginning of the tunnel. Will White's review of speleogenesis in the Nittany Grotto newsletter, the NSS bulletin on origin of limestone caves. See, these came right along at the right time. And Will, I've never properly thanked you. I didn't know you at the time, but your articles got me through the thesis without tearing all my hair out. So thank you officially. Here's some of the writing that inspired me at the time. Excellent summary of speleogenesis. And this symposium clarified all the points that I had picked up from Will's earlier writing. And this is just a page out of my thesis. It shows a whole bunch of relationships between things. I thought I'd just show you this to show that it had indeed happened. But then graduation occurred, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. I wasn't really sure I wanted to become a geologist. Seems odd at this point. But there were all sorts of other opportunities, and I decided to take a year off from college, and I worked for General Electric in Pittsfield as a computer technician, such as they were in those days, sorting punch cards and so forth. But in that year that I took off, a fellowship became available in hydrogeology for the Ph.D. at Indiana University. So I went straight from the master's, or rather from the bachelor's to the Ph.D., writing that fellowship. I am eternally grateful for having procrastinated that year, because it led to a whole bunch of other things that you're about to see. Well, my geographic scope at that time was very limited. I was born and sort of went to college around the same dot there, and we, as outing club members, kind of traveled around in that oval area down to West Virginia and places like that, but never out of that oval. And then finally, I got accepted at Indiana and went to Indiana and straight to their field station in Montana. Terrific experience. I came back a real geologist, or at least I thought I was. Southern Indiana is a karst area, and this is important because I thought what I should do is do a Ph.D. dissertation on straight hydrology, something that's going to be useful to the world, not on caves. My advisor, bless him, said, look, you're a well-experienced karst person. We're living in a karst area. You should do a study of karst. And so I did. It wasn't the greatest of dissertations, but it did open up a lot of questions. And those questions have been with me ever since. I want to acknowledge Dick Powell, who worked for the Indiana Geological Survey at the time, and sort of still does. He lurks in the building, same building as the geology department. And he, more than anybody, taught me field geology. An excellent geologist, not well known, but I want to congratulate him for a lifetime well spent teaching me. About 2 weeks after I had chosen my thesis area, some friends of ours who were just teenagers at the time discovered 3 extensions in a large cave nearby, right in the heart of my dissertation area. That was Blue Spring Cave. Here are the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Cowglazer. They enriched every trip we went on because we'd check in with them and they'd talk, both of them talking at the same time about 2 different subjects. And we'd go on to the cave, happy. Nice sinkhole pond in the background. And they owned the entrance, which is just over outside the picture on the right. And here's what it's like. This John and Joan Milroy in the Tunnel of Love. This is the main stream passage. You canoe maybe 3,000 feet upstream and you go through a maze. And this is what was the key to the discoveries. 3 major discoveries in the cave extended it tremendously, just unbelievably quickly. Things like this. Well, we surveyed in there. They wanted me to survey it because I'd had experience surveying it. Nobody else seemed to have the experience doing that, and they all helped, of course, and so it was a tremendous experience to be working in the cave. I spent about 95% of my time in mapping the cave, and the other 5% doing other geological things in my thesis area, so it was a very poorly conceived dissertation. Along the way, I acquired a friend, met her on a field trip. It was a karst field trip. Thinking of alignment of the stars and so forth, or planets. And pretty soon she was doing this sort of thing. Peg was the daughter of a professor at University of Cincinnati, professor of English history. And so they didn't want to know about this, nor did we share our experiences with them particularly, because it gets worse and worse. And who else would tolerate their bathtub looking like this? These are the notes. And somewhere along the line, we realized that we had a large cave on hand. We mapped something like 9 miles in the first 9 trips. These were long trips and very fast ones. And I realized, well, here's Will White again coming through with a list of the longest known caves. And I started down the list here, yes, and then I realized that Blue Spring Cave was number 5 on the list. So unknowingly, we had mapped the longest cave in the world, I should say the 5th longest cave in the world. That didn't last for long. Jewel Cave went sailing past it very quickly, and others passed it. And it's not even the longest in Indiana anymore. But that's how it was back in those days. Here's the new entrance arranged by Jim Richards, who is one of the mappers and explorers. The cave became a tourist cave, and it still is. It's one of the major tourist caves of the state. And so kind of thanks to the explorers and to the mappers, we had a fairly substantial cave on our hands. I'd like to acknowledge all of these people, and several of them are here. Bud is here, Sam Frushauer is here at the convention anyway, and Peg, of course, is here. Here's the map on a air photo. Sinkhole Plain. This is a sinkhole plain cave with all sorts of sinkholes coming in and pouring sediment and so forth into the cave. We also found that there were 2 mazes in the cave, right here and down here. These are blown up here, A and B below. And this piqued my interest because these mazes formed, number 1 at A, where a passage had collapsed and water was forced around during floods to form this intricate maze of about 1.5 kilometers of passage. This one right here looks quite different. It's nice curvaceous passages that are along bedding plane partings rather than joints. And these formed pretty much in the same way because the bedding plane partings had chert along them, which impeded the flow or the growth of the passage, so that the water had to spread out laterally rather than to go through joints. We've seen this before, what to do after graduation. I finally finished my dissertation. I was married, had a Ph.D. Kind of on the way, and I still didn't know quite what to do. I thought, you know, a life as a state geologist or maybe working in a state geological survey would be a good deal. I was not going to teach. That was one thing I was not good at. I realized that right off, and so that was not even on the radar screen. But as the D-Day arrived, when I had to make the decision, I started to think about summers and freedom and ability to do things on my own rather than following somebody else's dictum. And so I ended up looking for a job as a teacher. And what happened was I ended up in New York State. And New York, the State University of New York has 64 campuses, 400,000 students at the moment. And I was at one of those campuses. It was no bigger nor no smaller than a lot of the other ones, but it specialized in things like the sciences and technology. And so I thought, well, a couple of years here and then I'll move on to a real university. And I realized that as time went on, I'd spent maybe 30 years doing this, and I still hadn't moved on because I couldn't see it getting any better than what I was doing. I think that was a wise choice. Another wise choice was going to the Northeast because I could see a lot of my old friends and meet new ones. Chuck Porter was there still at RPI. Ernst Kastning was there. There's Ernst. Yeah, in his long underwear, hiding behind a wetsuit's bottom. Nice Bob Addis, who established the Northeastern Cave Conservancy. John and Joan Milroy were there later on, and got to know them and goof off a lot with them. Tom Engel was there, and Emily and Mike. I want to point out something here. Emily and Mike have done much more for Northeastern caving than we ever have. And I wanted a really good picture of them, and I settled on this one here. But I went to the web to find pictures of Emily and Mike, Emily Davis and Mike Warner. Look them up on the web for images. And I've cleared this with Emily. I actually pulled this picture out of the show because I thought it was disrespectful and not appropriate for a Luminary series. But here's... But I knew I was on the right track because look at this. So with many apologies, and thank you to Emily and Mike. Main projects over the years, we're looking ahead now, and we couldn't have envisioned this, but we spent a lot of time at Skull Cave, McPhail's and so forth in New York, Blue Spring in Indiana, but then Mammoth Cave we had been to while still in Indiana. But the others followed along one after the other, and I want to just give you a little bit of perspective here. as to how much time was involved in these. We tend not to try to see every cave in the region, but following Marion Smith's lead, I seem to keep track of logistics and so forth, and time spent underground. Blue Spring really didn't account for much, but Mammoth Cave over the years, 648 trips and 180 days of underground at Mammoth. That's a lot of darkness. A little bit about Mammoth Cave. I had been asked to go down to Mammoth Cave by CRF after the '65 NSS convention in Bloomington, Indiana. I gave a little talk on mapping and didn't say much of anything, but they asked if I wanted to see a big cave. And I said, would you like to see a big cave? So we went and brought them through Blue Spring, and they were enchanted and so forth. So we went to Mammoth Cave. This was before I knew Peg, or actually before I married Peg, so a lot of that happened without her along. On my very first trip down there, we ended up under Mammoth Cave Ridge. That spot right there represents Q87, the final survey station in the Q survey, which was bound for Mammoth Cave Ridge. And we'd gotten under the ridge because we could tell it's dry and so forth. And hit breakdown. And couldn't climb up through the breakdown. We tried to, but in order to get rid of the breakdown, we had to move it through this little crawlway or swallow it or something. There just wasn't any place to put it. And so we never got through there. Other routes went through eventually around that. You can see two of them there going around. But that was my introduction. And then together, Peg and I have been working on Crystal Cave. This was sort of dumped in our laps. We were happy about it, but they said that, well, you're the only ones that still remember how to get around in there. Roger Brucker, of course, could, but he was busy with other things like writing. And then Peg and I and Don Coons and Sherry Engler were fortunate enough to make this connection here between Proctor Cave and Morrison Cave, so we somehow kind of got involved in one of the big connections. There's Don going down a pit in Morrison Cave. Here's Josh Rubenstein going through a passage needlessly through the water, but I just wanted a picture of him in the water. And typical tourist trail in Mammoth Cave. We spent a lot of time studying the cave, mapping the geology, and this is really the first step in any serious interpretation of a cave. It ended up with something like this weird sherbet-colored book put out by Zephyrus Press. This is the guide that was written in '81, summarizing what we knew about the cave at that time, which was most of it, but not all of it. We spread out doing a lot of things. Hellhole was a favorite. This is back when we still used Prusik slings. That was, we didn't switch over until about 1980. And looks as though we could use a little practice there with the knots. But anyway, we did a lot of alpine caving, and mainly in Austria. I gave Dave a bunch of sort of pseudo facts about what we had done over the years, like introducing SRT to Britain and things like that, which is true but totally misleading. And one of them was to discover the lowest point in an Austrian cave that became the deepest cave in the country. Here it is, and it was at one time the deepest cave in the country. We, of course, didn't start out at the top. We started out at the bottom in a place called Bierloch, which is where they used to store their beer when they were walking up the trail to the main entrance. There's just this little hole about this big, and they just put their beer in it. It was really nice to come back and have cool beer. But they said, hey, you know, you want to explore something new? And sure, why not? And they said, okay, go in here. So we went in. Peg and I were leading. We said, well, don't you want to lead? And they said, no, you go ahead, kind of grinning. So we went ahead, and it got bigger. And I wasn't about to let anybody pass me, so I went down into this thing and ended up in a major passage, which and then dropped down into a pit with a rope. And it became known that day as the Three Nation Passage. For 4 Austrian cavers, a Swiss caver, Rene Scherer, who has joined us on many NSS conventions, and the 2 of us from America. Rene is from Switzerland, and then so that's 3 nations if you add them all up, 1, 2, and 3. So we really do end up on the map of one cave anyway. We went to Bermuda, and Michael Queen invited us there, including John and Joan Milroy, and so Joan and Peggy are off out of the picture wisely. We got invited to Silvertip, Montana by Bill Steele. One summer we decided we weren't going to do anything. We would just show up at the convention and see what happened. Sat down next to Bill Steele and he says, "Come to Silvertip." This was almost the deepest cave in the country, or it didn't quite make it. But it was pretty exhilarating caving because the temperature of the water was 33 degrees. It was snow melt going into the entrances. And so when you reach a place like this and you're swimming around, it feels as though your heart is going to stop. So that was pretty interesting experience for people that had grown up in easy caving. The usual stuff in Tag. Huautla, nothing major here, just a look-see at some of the passages in the cave. Puerto Rico, trip with Kevin Downey. And working with Marcus Gary at Zacatón in Mexico for his dissertation. We've spent a lot of time at Carlsbad. Carlsbad is not the, this isn't in chronological sequence by any means. Went to Carlsbad about 1970 and have been going back periodically, often with Mike Queen and others here ever since. Boneyard, Lechuguilla Cave entrance, typical scene in Lechuguilla Cave with its secondary gypsum and deep rifts that extend down to the water table. This is Sulphur Shores. In order to understand Carlsbad, it really helps to go to Tabasco, Mexico, where caves that are formed like Carlsbad are still forming today. Carlsbad was formed by sulfuric acid rising up from below, or rather hydrogen sulfide rising up from below and converting to sulfuric acid when it reacted with oxygen. Same thing happens here. Here's Dave Lester looking on sulfur rivers, they call it, Rios Azufre, coming out of a spring. And you go to the cave and this is what you see. Hydrogen sulfide is coming out of this cave at prodigious amounts, and here we are at the entrance. We're not even in the cave yet. This is a meter that measures toxic gases, and it's beeping a warning signal to get out of there fast. And we weren't even in the cave yet. We're 30 feet from the entrance. Here we are inside wearing gas masks, which is a wise idea, and we see 2 types of water coming in. Sulfuric acid type water from the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, and iron oxide being deposited in this oxygenated water. Where they mix, sulfuric acid is formed. But most of the sulfuric acid takes place is formed in air, where it's absorbed by moisture droplets and films. And these moisture droplets become quite acidic. These things here are known as snotites because that's what they look like. And they are rubbery bacterial filaments. You can pull on them like this and boing, they act like rubber bands. On the tips are droplets of water that have acquired both hydrogen sulfide and oxygen. And in each droplet, sulfuric acid is generated. Now those droplets that linger the longest turn into really strong sulfuric acid. We measured an average of 1.4 pH in these things. The lowest we measured was 0.07 pH. Many of these drops gave an error message on the pH meter. This had been calibrated to low pHs, so these are sort of real. And when these long lingering ones drop on your clothes, they'll burn a hole through your shirt and burn your skin. Zakatone, just a revisit here, is formed by sort of the same processes. There's a lot of hydrogen sulfide involved, but it's not nearly as concentrated. Here we are paddling around in this 1,000-foot deep water, regrettably where a friend died, Sheck Exley, when he was trying to break the world's depth record by scuba diving. And a spooky experience. I noticed the texture of the walls. What was my main research goal in doing all of this stuff? I was interested in what controls cave patterns. That was my goal, and I feel as though I've achieved that, but in doing so it required a lot of detailed geologic mapping. That's really number one. Then analytical approaches using the hydrology and the chemistry to make it all make sense. You can't form a cave without both of those. And then finite difference modeling seems like icing on the cake, but it actually helped to break through in many ways the barrier of what actually controls the difference between say a branching cave and a maze cave. But one of the most important things is to go to various places and compare patterns in a variety of karst areas rather than just simply picking one. Question is, if you have an initial situation like this where there are lots of fractures in the ground, which of those fractures are going to be lucky enough to turn into caves? If that's the right term. So we did a lot of mapping like this. This is a Nesquitaw Cave in New York, one of our hometown caves, so to speak. And it had just about all the ingredients necessary. Nice vadose to phreatic transitions, floodwater conditions, and so forth. Maze sections and dendritic sections. And so this was an example of what we tried to achieve by going into the cave and doing more than mapping, but show why it looked the way it did. And then into the finite difference analysis. Most people are not familiar with this sort of thing, but if you take an idealized fissure and break it up into little segments and run idealized water through it with idealized chemistry and so forth, you get an idealized answer. Most people are not happy with this because you have to have faith in what you're doing. It's easy to misstep, but this worked out fairly well and simple enough that it didn't require much in the way of an interpretation. This graph drives people crazy, but it shows the approximate time that it would take for a fracture to enlarge enough to start forming a real cave. In other words, the solution rate increases to the point where the cave actually begins to form. Prior to that time, the cave is sort of in its gestation stage where the chemical rate is so slow that nothing much is happening. And this tells us how fast it takes to achieve that. You can see that the width has a big impact here. The larger the width, the shorter time it will take to reach that breakthrough. The temperature has an effect. The PCO2 has an effect. Open versus closed conditions. I use closed as sort of the standard because that seems logical that the water would fill the entire passage and not be in contact with air and so forth. So you can see the times here. Those times don't mean much. They're just relative. But the most important thing I thought was this, that if we envision an aquifer with water going through it, through many different paths, each one of those paths is going to have a different point on this graph. There's the tube radius, or fracture width if you want. There's the discharge, the distance of flow, and so forth. And with all of these things varying, you end up with a lot of different points, each one of them representing a different flow path. These ones at the top of the graph, highest on the graph, will enlarge fastest, and they will independently reach the top of the graph first. These others will probably be too slow to reach the top. They will probably even diminish in solution rate as these top ones pirate more and more flow. So only a few of these things are going to form passageways, and those are the ones that you see in a typical cave, like a branching cave. However, if we have a situation where all of the passages reach that breakthrough point at the same time, we are up here, everything is forming at the same time at the same rate. And when that happens, you end up with a maze. And in order to achieve that, we need to have a situation like this, where the discharge over the length and over the r, the radius, is greater than this amount here. That's what produces this clustering at the top of the graph. I'm not trying to explain this in total detail, just giving you an idea of what we're looking for. In order to achieve this, we can have short flow distances. In other words, the length will be short. Epikarst, where there's a sandstone caprock, etc. Allogenic recharge, where there's a high gradient giving us a high discharge. Mixing, where the solution capacity is produced right in situ, in other words, right there, so the flow length is essentially zero along seacoast caves and so forth. And then hypogenic caves, which do essentially the same thing, where you mix hydrogen sulfide with oxygen and other things like that. Artesian confinement was a very popular explanation for maze caves. But it turns out that artesian confinement by itself doesn't do the job. In fact, we're going to just remove that. Here's an example. This is epikarst. Water goes in. The flow distance is essentially zero, and so everything enlarges at the same rate. Anvil cave. Water goes through sandstone like this. There's some debate about this, of course, but let's say that the water goes down through the sandstone, enters every single joint, and no matter how wide that joint is, the sandstone is acting as a governor to the flow, so that no matter how big the passage is, the same amount of water will come into it as goes into the narrow ones. And so they all enlarge at the same rate. And our old favorite mazes in Blue Spring, these are floodwater mazes where when water is ponded up behind an obstruction, water will go around the constriction in such a high rate that all of the passages will enlarge more or less at the same rate, forming a maze. Two-dimensional modeling by others like Wolfgang Dreibrot and Franzi Gavroschek have gone way beyond this point. I fiddled around with this and realized I didn't want to do any more because it would be too time-consuming and a little bit hard to interpret. And in fact, you have to be a little bit careful of this because it's so easy to say, let's have water go in here, 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 etc., and see what happens. Well, you've forgotten that there's an awful lot of water. Most of the water volume in the aquifer has not entered by that mechanism. It's pretty much at saturation, but it's got its own flow patterns, its own heads, and so forth. And so we have to be a little bit careful to include that portion of the flow as well. So you can easily get misled by this sort of thing. Approach to teaching hydrology. I suppose I should talk about this a little bit. First of all, know the concepts. I spent a lot of time describing the forces and processes and things like that. I didn't talk about karst and caves. In fact, that was not one of the courses I taught. Math and so forth, and math and software and so forth can be understood as long as you know the concepts. Know the fluid mechanics, not just Darcy's law, but pipe flow, hydraulics, and karst, of course. So that when karst appears on the scene, we can slot it into the overall picture, and it makes a lot more sense to contrast the karst with the other type of hydrology. And so the students coming out of the program were able to handle both types of flow. The little karst that they got actually made some sense. I didn't dwell on it, though. Never trust a model without being able to explain what's happening in simple terms. This was very important because we had a course in modeling that would enable you to do all sorts of marvelous things. But it turned out that the best part of a model is that it forces you to know what to enter into it. It asks you certain questions, and you realize, I don't know what the boundaries are on this aquifer, or how thick it is, and so forth. You've got to go out and measure those things. Use a holistic approach where you add all of these things together, the hydrology, the geology, chemistry, etc. And if you can't draw it, you don't understand it. That's kind of how I approached it. And we spent a lot of time doing this sort of thing rather than going to caves. Pipe measuring flow with an orifice weir and doing drawdown tests and things like that. This is the sort of thing that the companies that hire the students need them to know. Dealing with contaminant transport and so forth. In a karst area, you have all sorts of problems, and a diagram like this can help you understand why monitor wells in karst are not going to do the job. You see a lot of equations like this in the textbooks, and these are really a bad idea because they turn people off from the field. I actually worked with this sort of thing. It's not very difficult if you answer them using computer stepwise solution. But this is a very simple situation where you've got pumping well that doesn't tap the entire aquifer. Observation wells that might be in a different part of the aquifer. It's simple enough, but you end up with an equation like this. That's crazy. So how did my career as a hydrology prof work out? Well, as envisioned, it was not very successful at first. I was not an eloquent speaker. In fact, you can see the residual aspects of my shyness in front of a group today. I'm not very fluent in what I talk about. But it got better with time. I lost my shyness. I didn't improve my speech very much, but I was happy to see that people really enjoyed the courses. I started the water resources program at the college, which was the first of its kind in the system, and it turned out to be the largest of its kind in the Northeast. And so our students sort of spread out throughout the Northeast, and there were consulting firms that were eager to receive them. That was a very nice achievement. I was happy about that. But then a couple of things happened that surprised me. One was that I was given the distinction of what's called a distinguished teaching professorship. And there were only 3 of us at the campus, and I felt as though I didn't deserve it. I really did. But somebody thought that I did, and so I was happy to accept it. I don't tell people about this. In fact, it came with a lot of perks, such as having a personal secretary and the ability to go around to any campus in the system. But I never chose those options because I was there teaching a program that I had started, and I wanted to continue doing that. The second odd thing was that I wrote an article for the GSA Bulletin, and that received the Kirk Bryan Award in geomorphology for being something or other. I don't know what it was, a good paper. And that was sort of an odd thing because I'm not a geomorphologist. I'm from a small school, and the topic was karst. And at that time, karst was right on the cusp of being in the shadows versus breaking out into the big time. And so I told people, well, you know, that third one, being on karst, it was quite an achievement for me to realize that being able to write something about karst would actually attract attention. So, okay, I think that's the answer. Here's the first page of the article in the GSA Bulletin. This is exciting stuff, isn't it? This one here, nobody's seen this one. This is in Spanish. This is translated by Javier Mujica Geronimo from Cuba, whom I've met once. He said, could I translate this into Spanish so that we could distribute it to the Latin American countries? And I said, sure, but I don't want any financial returns for it. It should all go to you and your your club, basically the club, which is in really bad financial straits, thanks in part to our crazy diplomatic relationships. This next one here brings up the topic of what have we contributed to the NSS. In general, it is such things as working in the background, not organizing other people's things. The organization part of the NSS is something that we could do, but we choose not to because it would take us away from such things as this. This represented a whole year of our lives. We went to China when I retired in 2005. We went to China. There's Bet White in the background, eating one of these, who knows what the heck it is. Seeing caves like this and big sinkholes like this. This cable, by the way, is not to hold the world together so it doesn't split along this gulf. It's to ride a motorcycle over. If you think I'm kidding about that, ask me afterward. Okay, Black Hills have figured into our history quite a bit. We've spent a lot of time there, and it's been a marvelous experience. Looking at Jewel Cave, Wind Cave, looking at some diagenetic features that are kind of mysterious, that are objects of debate, and crawling around. And this one, whenever anybody names something after me, it's always something horrible. And this, I believe, I have a hunch that Mike Wiles was behind this name, but this is a place that was so tight that I couldn't go through it. And for the fourth time on that trip, I had to take my clothes off. And I squeezed through this spot. This is Renee Ohms going through. She's built like a wire, and she had trouble. But Peg went through, and somebody else went through, and I forced myself through. And this is the result. And the art attack, as it became known, has been pushed recently by this team to fill in a large part of this section here, and it goes. The last trip left rooms with passages, big passages, going off in all directions. So that's the only place named for me in the whole system. Planning a career, teach at a Ph.D. granting institute. Don't follow my lead. Avoid undergraduate at all costs. Publish only where it's going to advance your career. Obtain major grants, yes, of course. Treat science like a business. Stay away from karst. How about none of those? That's what I do. Is choose a job that fits and which serves a valid purpose. I would not fit into a very large university. I'm just not that type. Focus on what you do best. Science should be fun. Keep it that way. Learn valid quantitative skills, etc. And stay active and interested. Ignore advancing age. I've been ignoring it and considering myself still a kid. And support the NSS. That will make you happy. In the meantime, we still continue things like Left of the Trap and Crystal Cave, which is up to about 8,000 feet of crawling both ways, not entirely on your hands and knees. And last year at the NSS convention with Phil Murray and Piercy's Mill, we just enjoy being underground and the friendship that goes with it. And of course, some things never change. This is from last year. So I ended up doing basically what I envisioned when I was a kid. And I couldn't have done it alone. Thanks a lot, Peg. And thanks all of you and the NSS for making it possible. Well, thank you, Dave. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming and making it a standing room only audience. Art is a dear friend and obviously a very special guy. We're so lucky to have him. We have time for a few questions, which Art has agreed to entertain, and he's also willing to hang out in the lobby a little bit after the session. So if you'd like to shake your hands with a truly good American, get a book signed, or have a picture taken with Art Palmer, please feel free to do so right outside. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, Bill.
Yeah, Art, I'm glad to see that you learned how to assemble a carbide lamp.
He's referring to a situation, what was it, 1970, where there was a carbide lamp assembling contest. Put on a blindfold and have your carbide lamp completely disassembled. And assemble it with your eyes closed, pour carbide into it, pour water into the top, and then light it. Well, I did everything except that when I flipped open the top flipped open and flipped back shut again, so I poured water onto the carbide lamp. Almost went, but it didn't quite. So the subject got great ridicule.
You won a rope out of it.
I did. Getting a lot of kisses and laughter and so forth.
Any other questions? Okay, Peg and Art, thank you once again for coming. It's really